Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to see so many of you logging in for tonight's science talk. We're going to run things just a little bit differently tonight during this science talk. So pay attention because I'm about to give instructions. Oh, and I'm sorry for those of you who are returning participants because I have no stupid joke tonight. I failed you and I'm sorry about that. But anyway, since we're running things a little differently, this is what we're going to do. Dr. Nyman has said he welcomes questions during his presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open everybody's mics. So if you want to remain muted during the presentation, unless you have a question, that would be fantastic. So I'll be unmuting all of you here in a second so that if you want to use your microphones to ask a question tonight, you're more than welcome to do that. If you do not have a microphone or want to interrupt Dr. Nyman during his talk, you're more than welcome to use the question box to either type your question and then I'll relay that question for you, or just let me know that you have a question and I'm happy to interrupt for you, however you want it to work. So if those instructions are clear, great. If you want more clarification on what I'm thinking was articulate, but maybe not, send the question to me in the question box, which you'll find in your dashboard under the dark gray line that says questions. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna go ahead and unmute people. And well, actually, let me do the introduction first, and then I will unmute you while Dr. Nyman gets started. So first of all, thank you so much, Andy, for agreeing to do a science talk for us tonight.
You're welcome.
It's really great to see you. Andy and I go way back, so it's been fun just hanging out with him for the last 45 minutes. So to introduce Andy, Andy earned a bachelor's in biological sciences from the University of New Orleans. I did not know that, Andy. Wow, graduate in 1984. He then worked an 8-on, 6-off schedule for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, collecting environmental data, enforcing wildlife laws, and assisting researchers at the mouth of the Mississippi River. He then returned to school to get a master's in wildlife. Is that correct, Andy? From LSU in 1989. But instead of returning to LDWF, he decided to pursue a PhD in oceanography and coastal studies from LSU, which he did earn in 1993. After which, he took a position at the University of Louisiana Lafayette until 2001, when he decided to return to LSU. He is a professor in the School of Renewable Natural Resources and has authored or co-authored over 80 peer-reviewed publications addressing wetland loss, soils, vegetation, wildlife, fish, hydrology, and nutrient dynamics. So again, Andy, it is such a pleasure to have you give tonight's science talk. And I love catching up with you, and thank you for that bio. So all of you in the audience, you'll be unmuted here in a second. Good luck with that, Andy. And again, you guys, Andy has welcomed questions during the presentation, so don't hold them in. And I can tell you from personal experience, he loves the interaction. So do not allow, oh, I don't want to interrupt or anything to prohibit you from asking questions. In fact, he told me earlier today, I'd rather not finish my presentation and get a crap ton of questions than finish my presentation and get no questions. So the invite has been extended. And it's all yours, Andy.
All right, give me a minute to do this again. I'm going to show my screen. I'm going to show the clean monitor 2. You should be looking at yourself. And then that's not what I meant to do. All right, hold on here. Let's try this. Do y'all see, what do y'all see right now?
We see your title slide.
Do you see all the slides on the little?
We do. So yeah, just go to presentation mode within PowerPoint and you're good.
Well, let me try this one then. Now, which one do you see?
Ah, that's the one you want. There you go.
Yeah, there we go. All right. All right. Yeah. Thanks, Mert, for the invitation, and I thank the audience for being the audience. We'll be talking about wetlands tonight. Wetlands. There's a lot of ways to define it. To me, that means a place where the vegetation is dominated by plant species that are adapted to tolerate flood stress. The wetlands make up a small part of our land area in the lower 48 states, less than 6%. Of that 6%, the vast majority are freshwater wetlands, and most of those are forested. Only about 5% of our wetlands are coastal wetlands. And so the coastal wetlands are the rarest of the rare, you know, so it's quite it's a small part of our landscape. This map is a map of the National Wildlife Refuge System, and you can see some wetland areas in here. You see the prairie potholes up here. You can see the Mississippi Valley, Alluvial Valley coming down, Central Valley, California, Columbia River Valley. But look at the coastal wetlands all around. 1/3 of the National Wildlife Refuges are coastal wetlands. And so it just goes to show you that how valuable wetlands in general are to fish and wildlife, and especially coastal wetlands. And so wetlands do a lot of things besides provide fish and wildlife habitat. One of them is just providing vegetation, and this is vegetation is crucial because it provides a habitat for fish and wildlife, and also it can provide income for landowners. Sustainable forestry is a thing in wetlands. The other functions down here, it's very difficult for the landowner to make any money off of them. That's one way I think it's real important to think about wetland functions, is these upper three. The landowner can actually benefit economically from them. Certainly can't take the fish and wildlife do not belong to the landowner, at least not in North America. Canada, US, and Mexico, the wildlife belong to all citizens. Landowner owns the land, not the animals. But because he owns the land, the landowner can decide to let people hunt or not hunt on their land, catch fish or not catch fish. And so they can charge you for that. And that's basically all a hunting lease is, it's permission to access the land. But these other functions, the ones that we often talk about, the only reason why there's regulations, these functions over here, water quality, flood reduction, and carbon storage, there's very little, it's not yet possible for the landowner to benefit economically from them. That's changing. We're trying to change the way our economic systems work so that landowners can be paid for these things. So it makes sense that the first wetland management would have benefited benefited the landowner, benefited the person managing the wetland. So it probably would have been for vegetation, wildlife, or fish, and not for flood storage, water quality improvement, or carbon sequestration. This book here is by Rippon. Is a fascinating book. It deals with the transformation of coastal wetlands during Roman and medieval periods, and he classified what happened in this way. It's a really useful, I think, accurate way of looking at things. He talks about how people would first just exploit the wetland. They would occupy it seasonally. It wouldn't be a permanent residence. They would go there the times of the year when the grass was growing so that they could harvest the hay, or they'd bring their cattle or sheep with them to graze them there, or they'd catch fish and wildlife. And then the next thing people might do would be to modify the wetland. And generally, what Rippon was talking about was some reductions in flood stress, a little bit of drainage. The most drainage these people could pull off, with the resources they had, but it wouldn't be enough to transform it into an upland. It'd only be enough to reduce flood stress, so you get more production out of your wetland grasses. And you'd either get more hay out of it, or you'd be able to put more sheep and cattle on it. And that's what that was the next stage of wetland transformation. And then after a while, there would become transformation. That's when you would move from just having some ditches to also using levees to exclude high water. So modification would take ditches to drain off water. Transformation to an upland would take levees to exclude high water. And then it's not a wetland anymore. And it's important to realize that even though I talked about it being sequential, it didn't always go that way. There's a lot of wetlands that never made it from one stage to the other. In particular, there's a lot of wetlands that remain merely modified, although Rippon and others who wrote about similar topics in other parts of the world, the Mayans, for example, they would consider this wetland management. To me, it's not really wetland management because they're settled for it. It's incompletely drained, if you will. But the reason that you would have these persisting was that, well, imagine two wetlands. They're both 1 mile square. One of them has got upland on 3 sides. The other one has, and it's upland on 3 sides. And so you only need 1 mile of levee to get 640 acres of agricultural land. Whereas the other one is, got upland only 1 side. You need 3 miles of levee to turn that into agricultural land. And so the investment, just isn't worth it there to bring that land under. Or you can have a place that is just too far away from a market. You could levee it and raise a lot of hay or a lot of sheep, but you had no one to sell to. And so for these economic reasons, you had wetlands that remain merely modified for centuries. And so this is a diagram, the figure that I'm going to use to talk about that. So, natural wetlands that can be exploited, you modify them, incompletely drained. In my mind, it's not wetland management, at least not for this talk, but I can see how you would want to call that a managed wetland, and then a formal wetland. And so let's look at one of these modified wetlands. This is from the Roman period. There's no levee. You've got some ditches here, and then you've got a dam here, and you've got this, a diker is what it's called, going through the dam, and there's a flap on the end of the diker. And so water can drain out whenever the water is lower here in the creek. When the tide comes up, the flap closes, and it's not a perfect seal, but it's going to slow down water re-entering there. And so you got to reduce flood stress in the adjacent wetland. You're going to get more grass for your sheep and cattle. Here's a drawing of it. Here's the pipe going through it. Here's the flap on the end. Here's a side view and a top view, and how they hung the hinge. This is fascinating to me, by the way. This wood, a tree, they've cut it so that you can hang the flap from it. The back end is narrowed so they can fit one of these into another one and extend these 2 or 3 trees in a row to make these pipes. I just think that's kind of fascinating. That same technology is represented here. That's a Roman diker, from 75 to 125 AD. This is from the early 1700s in eastern Canada. This is what the Acadians were using to drain the marshes around the Bay of Fundy to make agricultural fields. And here's the flap. This is a single pine tree. And then they put slats over it and then buried it in the levee to make that structure. But again, that's not wetland management model of mine. This is wetland management. You got the flap, you got a flap on the outside, but you've got it raised up here so water can go in. But what really makes this wetland management is on the inside, instead of just having an open pipe, you've now got this structure here. And unfortunately, these structures are very similar in many parts of North America and Europe, but they go by many different names. And so it's difficult to talk about them. I'll use this. Here they call it a riser. But you have these boards, you can stack up the boards in there and flood the wetland inside. You can take all the boards out and completely drain the wetland, or you can leave some of the boards in and have water in the ponds, but not on the marsh surface. And so it gives you a lot of things you can do to the water in the marsh. And that's wetland management. So when did this start? That's the question. When did this start? Well, we know that even up until the 1800s, people did not ever manage the wetland. If they could take a modified wetland, an incompletely drained wetland, and if they could get the economic benefit from it, they would drain that wetland completely and turn to agriculture. So when did this happen? That's the question. So it's certainly after the 1850s, after the mid 1800s. It looks like it to me that it began with wildlife management, which I like this definition here from 1980. It's largely a matter of habitat management and application of harvest strategy. I paraphrase that for my students as saying wildlife management is either applied plant ecology or it's public relations. And I'm not trying to denigrate public relations at all. In fact, without the public being behind what we do in wildlife management wouldn't happen. It's equally important to the applied plant ecology side. So here's a publication from 1911. It's from the 1910 Agricultural Yearbook. Oldest was writing about commercial hunting then, and one of the things he's doing is reviewing wildlife harvesting, the business of wildlife harvesting. Well, you're shooting ducks or egrets or herons or whatever and selling them. How that had progressed throughout the country for the past, century and a half. And it was the same story. It moved across the country. We're shooting too many and we're destroying the habitat. It just kept going on, and it kept on going on really until that business died out just a few years after this was published. He was unable to save that business. But there was no mention of habitat management in this publication. It's about overharvest. You go up to 1914, you see this publication here, 5 important wild duck foods. Now, I assume that since the earliest hunters, they were cutting open the stomachs of the animals they killed to see what they eat and figure that out so where in the landscape. You find those plants again, you find out what that animal's eating. I assume that's been going on for eternity. But, this is the first systematic study of wildlife food habits that I know, and publication in a way that can be found again. These are the duck foods. They identified important duck foods. They show you where on the country they occur. A few years later, 1917, they're figuring out how they grow. Do they grow best from seed? Do they grow from tuber? What time of year do you plant them? How much flooding do they want? How much can they take? This publication a year later, trying to use these plants like you would plant ornamental vegetation around your house or a crop. You're planting on roadsides, college campuses, and cemeteries. And I don't think that had much. They had much luck attracting water birds or any birds based on that. That didn't work. But you get to 1928, and that paper was actually read at the 1925 meeting of the Ecological Society of America. And Biosco, who was just coincidentally from Louisiana, he was led the Department of Conservation then. But he wrote, "It seems, therefore, that we cannot always legislate vanishing species back into existence. And we must look to their conditions of life and relations to their surroundings for the key to solution." That's that phrase, conditions of life and their relation to their surroundings. That's ecology. That's why the journal Ecology chose to publish it. This is wildlife management. This is the earliest description I know of wetland management. I'm going to walk you through another one of his paragraphs, one sentence at a time, to demonstrate to you that they understood the same problems. They understood the problems and saw the same solutions that we do today. One of the things they were worried about was the oil and gas canals that we see today and navigation canals. Artificial drainage. They wrote, in the tidal country, this could be done by the employment of levees and dams, which would permit an inflow, but would prevent drainage below a level which is detrimental to those species. So trying to prevent excess drainage caused by the channelization of our coastal marshes. They're worried about saltwater intrusion. Where the tidal conditions do not predominate, we need to restore the freshwater marshes, because as people dug canals across the marsh, the fresh water drained out and the tide water came in and made areas salty that had not been salty before. Talked about using freshwater diversions. In southeastern Louisiana, where the Mississippi River level is practically always above marsh level, you could irrigate them with siphons or other structures. So using the river to do freshwater diversions. And then, the river is only a little bit of Louisiana is next to the river. So where siphon water is not available, got to conserve the rainfall and the groundwater seepage, which we've lost all our groundwater inputs, it seems. But conserve that by levees that would keep it from draining from the over the surface into the canals, and also in dams and weirs to hold it in, with, prevent that unnatural drainage. And finally, combining wetland restoration and flood protection. It says with properly constructed relief outlets on the Mississippi in connection with flood control, the problem would almost solve itself. It's always a little more optimistic than I am, but they had the same vision of problems and the same vision of the tools to address those problems in 1925. 1938, this is from the Journal of Wildlife Management. This author Bradbury is writing about the effect of ditches such as these on the marshes. And one thing they couldn't do was completely plug the ditches. The ditches had ruined the marshes for water bird use as far as they were concerned, not just ducks, but also wading birds and shorebirds. But they couldn't totally block the ditches because then that would bring the mosquitoes back. So they could only partially block the ditches to prevent this extreme, the most extreme of the drainage. So the other thing that they noticed, they wrote about, was the other thing that had damaged the marsh as far as bird use was the lack of making hay. It was no longer economical for them to sell hay off the marsh. The vegetation had grown too thick, and that had made the marsh detrimental to shorebird use. And so they started burning the marsh, and that made the marsh once again suitable for shorebird foraging. So by 1942, you pretty much see all the same marsh management tools today that are available to many marsh managers up and down the Atlantic coast, Pacific coast, Gulf coast, even the Great Lakes. All those tools were described by 1942 in this paper here in the North American Wildlife Conference. A decade later, they were doing the second inventory of wetlands in the United States. The first had been the 1920s for the purpose of draining wetlands for agriculture. The second was in 1956 for the purpose of identifying wetlands to preserve and manage to improve habitat for fish and wildlife. This is a really cool paper here. It's from 1958 from the Transactions on North American Wildlife Conference. And they identify acid sulfate soils as being a problem. They had tried draining coastal wetlands for wildlife, and they ran into the problem of acid sulfate soils, which is a problem that continues today worldwide and is why I avoid eating farm-raised shrimp. So we can see that.
Hey, Andy, I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt real quick. We had a question about burning the marshes.
Yes.
So the question was about whether every fire that we see in our marshes, are those management burns, or are they hunters going after things? What's going on there? Do you know?
If you see a fire, so first of all, there are a lot of people out there who think let me just start from the beginning. The Native Americans burned the marshes every year based on the earliest writings of the Europeans. And the Europeans came in and thought that was savage behavior. And so burning the marsh was considered a sin in the 1800s. By the early 1900s, though, that started to change, and they started burning the marsh again, as the Native Americans did. And nowadays, it seems that there are people out there who think that you should burn the marsh anytime you're out there because it's the scientific thing to do. But that's a misconstruction of this 1920 idea that we need to return fire to the marsh. Nowadays, managed burns occur generally only outside of tropical storm season, and they occur almost always outside of the spring, when you've got a lot of nesting birds and nutria and rabbits and whatnot in the marsh. Managed fires that I know of are all set only in the winter. Closer to New Year's, the better. But still, there are places where it's a tradition to set the marsh on fire the last day of duck season. I've heard there are people who think it's tradition the first time they go out and speckled trout fish in the spring, they set the marsh on fire. And certainly lightning strikes cause our natural fires. Every July and August, fires are common because of lightning strikes. So, how's that? Does that satisfy, or is there some? Does that lead to another question?
Oh, I just got a thank you. So I guess we're good.
All right, good. I appreciate that. Like I said, I would rather not finish these slides and just do question and answer the whole time than finish these slides. But anyway, where were we? Let's see. Yeah, we're doing that. Yeah, acid sulfate soils. And so it's clear to me that wetland management became common in the early 1900s. I want to take a look at research in Louisiana. If you look at the journal articles, you'll see that it looks like it started in the 1970s. That's when you first start seeing the journal articles addressing wetlands in Louisiana. But if you go to the conference proceedings, you'll see they really kind of blow up in the 1960s. But it actually started even before then. If you look at the university theses and dissertations, at least at LSU, you'll see they blow up in the late 50s, early 60s. And I haven't looked at any other universities. But I'm going to go ahead and show you the 10 earliest theses and dissertations at LSU that address wetlands. First was 1934 from the Department of Botany looking at succession. The second was the Department of Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness looking at the fur trapper and the resources that make good muskrat habitat. That's a pretty good ecological study of the marshes at the time. 1953, civil engineering got into it, looking at soils, not really a marsh management thing. Verlander in 41 was definitely talking about marsh management. Belize in 34 did not. Treadwell, although he wasn't focused on management, the geology and the ecology go together so tightly in wetlands, and not just coastal wetlands, floodplain wetlands as well, prairie potholes. It's an excellent pairing of sciences. 1956, you see this ecological studies here of the marshes at Rockefeller Refuge at the School of Forestry, Wildlife, and Fisheries, which is the old name of my department where I am, which is now the School of Renewable Natural Resources. And then the next 5 are all from my old school, you know, in the 50s and leading up to the 60s. And it just keeps on blowing up after that, and more departments get involved in wetland research at LSU. So let's go ahead and stop.
Andy, I'm sorry, we got another question.
Right. Great.
This one is from, again, a while ago, but Arturo would like to know why you don't eat farm-raised shrimp.
Oh, because a lot of farm-raised shrimp come from areas that were a coastal mangrove swamp. And so all those trees are getting in the way, and so they chop down all the trees and keep it permanently flooded, and they raise shrimp in there. And that works pretty good for several years, but then the water gets really nasty and they start getting diseases. And so they drain it all out, and they keep it drained, maybe just a month or two, just long enough for acid sulfate soil to develop. And then when they reflood it, it's an acid sulfate soil. The pH drops down to less than 4, sometimes less than 3, and it's just devoid of life for many decades. And it happens because seawater has tiny, tiny amounts of sulfuric acid in it, tiny. But that accumulates in wetland soils, binds up with the iron for a decade or century, and it's okay there because it's not in an acidic condition. It's bound up with the iron. But when you drain it, it's all released within just the few weeks or months that you have the soil drained, and all that acid is there, and it takes a long time to get out. And the people who do shrimp farming, they just pick up and move on down the coast another few miles and do it to another mangrove swamp. And so that's my stereotyping of shrimp farming. And there's probably some sustainable shrimp farms out there that are getting the bad rep from my view of shrimp farming. And if there are some, I'm open to education right now. Should I be eating farm shrimp and not so much the wild caught?
Is that still a common practice in the US, or is that something
Oh,
that we
no, not
see?
the US. Vietnam now is big on it, Cambodia, Chile, South America, up and down the South American coast, Southeast Asia. That doesn't happen. That has not been a problem in the United States, as far as I know, since the early 1950s.
Oh, gotcha. So remember to eat Gulf shrimp.
Oh, I eat Gulf shrimp. Yes, I eat Gulf shrimp.
Thank you, Andy.
You're welcome. All right, let's get past these theses here. All right, let's take a look kind of where we are now. We'll come up to the most recent master plan, and we're going to look at some of the techniques in there. One of them, the Marsh Creation. This is where the most resources are going. 40 projects and a wishful $17 billion. Well over 250,000 acres. There's a $53,000 an acre price tag on it. And so when did this get started? Well, first let me show you what Marsh Creation is, just in case you don't know. It's taking sediment from one body of water and putting it in another body of water to make a wetland. In most of Louisiana, and we do a lot of these projects, we're not adding any new sediment to the coast. You're just taking it from one part of a lake and putting it in another part of the lake. I kind of regret using this example here because it represents a minority of projects. It's certainly not unique, but it's a minority of them where they're taking sediment from the Mississippi River that would otherwise just keep on going out the mouth of the Mississippi River into deep waters of the Gulf, but taking sediment from there and building a wetland with it here. And that's what happened here. But most of them do not add sediment to the coast. This is a 400-acre wetland created with Marsh Creation project. This is a pretty old technique, believe it or not. This is an engineer manual from the Corps of Engineers, 1983, and it's already got a manual on it. They've been doing it enough, and by taking it from navigation for navigation purposes. And looking at how this has evolved over time, it looks to me like the target elevation changed over time. Back when this was written, they were building wetlands at about the same elevation as the natural wetlands. Now they had to build it just a little bit higher because when you pump that sediment out, it's kind of fluffy and has to dewater and it's going to lose some elevation. And it's also going to induce some compaction of the pre-existing soil. And so they have to plan for that too. There's a lot of geotechnical measurements and estimation that go into that. So they have to build a little bit higher, but they were really just kind of shooting for the same elevations of natural wetlands. But in the early 2000s, people got concerned about sea level rise. And so they started building them, above the normal tidal prism with the idea that they were going to extend the life of the wetland because you give it this extra elevation. But that doesn't extend the life of the wetland. It actually delays the wetland benefits because this new wetland that you created is too high to get much use by fish or wildlife. It's too high to store much carbon. It's too high to have much water quality improvement. It does a good job of functioning like a levee, but it doesn't have much wetland benefit. But just in the past few years, it seems like this has been recognized and they're kind of back on track and getting the elevation back down low. And you don't want to get too low, but you want to get it as low as you can. And if I have a 33-minute presentation, much like this one, but entirely focused on creative marshes. And if you want to go ahead and print screen this, I'll hold off for just a second, and you can get that address. Also, I'll put it in the chat so you can get that address as a video presentation dealing just with constructed wetlands. So that came from the 1960s or 70s. The next most important type of technology on the master plan is freshwater.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt again. So a couple of things. I just put the link to that movie in the chat.
All right.
And I'm going to send it to everyone. We'll also include it in the follow-up email that you'll get tomorrow. And then we have a question.
Great.
From Josh. So this might require some long answer.
Okay.
So Josh is wondering, given how significant Louisiana's relative sea level rise is in the Mississippi River Delta, do you think saving Louisiana wetlands is a lost cause? I know some scientists are more pessimistic about Louisiana's coastal erosion problems, while others are more hopeful that we can preserve significant amounts of land. I'm just wondering where you fall on that issue.
I think we can preserve significant amounts of land, but even then, I'm afraid that word might be a little too strong, preserve. It's more like the marshes are like that 15-year-old car that many of us drive. You know, it would be a mistake in my mind to abandon it now. It'd be ridiculous to stop changing the oil and tires on it. You know, we can manage that thing and get a whole lot more life out of it. We get a whole lot more birds out of it, a whole lot more water quality out of it, a whole lot more carbon storage out of it. But it's not going to last forever. And there's one of the statements I remember is Louisiana is not a place, it's a process. The place where the process is going to be happening is going to be migrating inland. But the places that we have today, many of them are going to be gone in a century. So it's certainly I'm certainly optimistic about, I'm 60, I exercise and eat right, but I know it's not going to get me to be 160, but hopefully it's going to take me to 85 or so. And that's the way I feel about our coastal wetlands. Many of those acres are on their last few years. Some have another century or two left in them, but not all of them. Good question. And there's as many right answers out there as there are probably people in the audience. All right. Freshwater diversions are not. Oh, does that lead to any more questions though?
Not at the moment, but I'm sure there are some who are really busy typing.
All right. Well, while they're typing, I'll talk a little bit about freshwater diversions. That's another big part of our master plan, 5 billion as opposed to 17 billion. We started doing this, even before 1956, which I have listed here for the first diversion. Before 1956, the diversions were for floodwater reduction, getting the water out of the Mississippi faster. But in 1956, they built one solely for oysters, solely for maybe it's not a wetland benefit because the oysters don't grow up in the grass. So it's an estuarine benefit. And it worked so well that 20 years later, they replaced the structure with a bigger structure, allowed them to affect more acres of oyster habitat. And this is where that one was built by Lamoke in 1956. Here's an image I found on the internet. And, Carnarvon started its planning at that same time as an oyster structure, but was repurposed to manage oysters secondarily and emergent grasses first. And then there's also Davis Pond up there. It came online, I think it's 2003, Davis Pond. So freshwater diversions have been around since the mid 1900s. And Biosco recommended them explicitly in 1925. And it takes decades to make something that big happen. And we're working on some of those big things now. Some of those big things we're working on are sediment diversions. Only 3 of them, $1.8 billion, only about 80,000 acres, but look at the price per acre. Oh, that reminds me. Why don't I have dollars up here on freshwater diversions? Well, freshwater diversions aren't designed to build new land. They're designed to slow the loss of existing land. And that's so hard to quantify. Some people are going to say, yeah, you slowed it a little bit, but not enough. Other people say, you didn't slow it enough, or you actually sped it up. It's very difficult to find a control study when you're looking at freshwater diversions. Sediment diversions, you can tell how much land they build. Look at the price, it's much cheaper. Why don't we do that everywhere? Well, the Mississippi River doesn't flow close enough to Houma for us to use it to build wetlands near Houma or over in by Lake Charles. So we're just real limited to where we can use it. And we'd use it more if we could, I assume. Sediment diversions take this natural process that allows the river to build wetlands, built off Southeast Louisiana over the past 5,000 years and just manages that natural process. So this is the Birdfoot Delta. I want to zoom in on the Birdfoot Delta for this next slide here. Here's the Birdfoot Delta. This lower quarter of the Birdfoot Delta is the Passalute Wildlife Management Area. It's named after this pass, which is Passalute. And this is it's a wildlife management area, and it's a place where they've been using sediment diversion since the 1950s to build land. at least since the 1950s. This is from the 1958 biennial report, and they write about removing earthen plugs from the end of oil and gas canals so that the water can flow into the ponds and create these waterfowl food plants. The waterfowl food plant they're creating is that very first plant I showed you back in the 1914, the Delta duck potato. That's what they want. They're making wetlands, and it's just what they did down there. And it went on for decades, and they continued to do it. And in 1982, the state, and that was, that was not like that was not just that wasn't a big program or anything. It was just something the local managers realized would work, and so it's something the local managers did. Well, in 1982, Louisiana started its very first coastal wetland restoration plan or program, and they had 3 projects that very first year. One of them was the Passalute Marsh building project, which they also called the Freshwater Diversion, even though they're increasing marsh acreages. Here's a map. There were 3 sites within, so there are 3 projects. This one project had, and the other ones were, I think, a Barrier Island project and oyster project. But this one Passalute project had 3 of these sediment diversions in it, and much bigger that had been done than anything. Well, this number 2 was much bigger than anything that had been done before. Number 1 probably was. This is probably on the scale. This third site is probably on the scale of what had been done before. I'm going to show you a few pictures from this site 1 up here. This is that. This is where they opened the natural levee. They dug through the natural levee in 1987. I worked there then, and this was a solid bald cypress and willow bank when I worked there. And then they dug it while I was there, and then it was open while I was there. And then I went to grad school. And while I was in grad school, they built all these, about 200 acres of wetlands here. And this thing is kind of fascinating. Also, look, most of these wetlands that you see here were built by the channel that went to the east. And all that wetland got in the way, and so then had to find a new way, and that new channel came through here, but have very few wetlands, which is kind of like Bayou Lafourche and the modern channel of the Mississippi River, isn't it? Bayou Lafourche built all the wetlands of built many of the wetlands of Southeast Louisiana. The modern channel of the river built very few of the acres of the river. It just goes to show you the delta lobe process scales. It just scales across different spatial and time scales.
Hey, Andy, I actually have a question for you about Bayou Lafourche, since you mentioned it.
Yes.
So, FJ would like to know, in the 1990s, DNR was looking at the DNR was looking at the feasibility of using Bayou Lafourche as a freshwater diversion. Do you think that would work? At the time, there was pushback from landowners, and he's assuming that it was the oyster fishermen or the oyster industry.
So what I believe about that, I pretty much heard secondhand. And what I had heard was that there was just so much. So when Bayou Lafourche was dammed off in 1903, adjacent landowners crept into it, and so it got really, really tiny. And now Bayou Lafourche, to make it carry the water it did, even in 1900, would require massive widening and deepening. But that's all private property now, and so you would have to buy them out. And also, I remember some talk about the bridges over the bayou would need to be taken off. Have bridges with many fewer pilings underneath, because there are so many bridges with so many pilings that would really slow down the water flow and just cause the sediment to fall out in the channel. But I'm just repeating things that I was told. I don't know. I don't have a sense that I've developed on my own by trying to verify those points of view by coming at them from a different way. I know that the last I heard is that we need to get more water down Bayou Lafourche just so we can have more water for drinking, but I think they got to minimize the sediment that goes into it. Sorry, I don't know more about Bayou Lafourche.
Thanks, Andy.
You're welcome. I'd see those. Oh, there's another video you can watch here. This is a 6-minute video, and unlike the presentation video I've recommended before, in this video is like a professional job by the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and it's just about those sediment diversions that were built in 1986. and then also some of the subsequent sediment diversion. Very beautiful, well put together video. Also, there's this peer-reviewed paper dealing with the sediment diversions that were built on Delta National Wildlife Refuge, not down on Pass Salute. And they have an estimate of the acres of wetland built per year by those sediment diversions. Now, all these were uncontrolled sediment diversions, by the way. They're small enough and out of the way of navigation enough that there's no structure involved. It's just rip open the natural levee or the artificial spoil bank that's been piled up and let the river do as little or as much as it wants to do. The diversions we're talking about today on the main stem of the river are going to have to be controlled, make sure they don't interfere with the navigation. The last technique I'm going to talk about is marsh terraces. And notice they're not on the master plan. They're not on the master plan.
I'm gonna stop you again. I'm sorry. Before we get on to terraces, we have another question about diversion. So
yes,
Skylar would like to know, since the Mississippi River is so far east and river diversions seem costly or simply impossible as a solution to central or western Louisiana erosion, what are some possible techniques to increase the accretion of sediment in those areas?
I don't know. We need research on to figure out exactly that. You know, one of the points I was going to make at the end of this talk is that wildlife managers really, you know, developed wetland management in the early 1900s and became very good at managing wetlands to create the vegetation that creates food for waterfowl and also for wading birds and shorebirds, you know, mudflat conditions as well. In this next 50 years, someone's going to need to figure out how to manage wetlands to produce not only waterfowl foods, but also elevation. And that, you know, whether it's the wildlife people or someone else, someone's going to need to figure that out. The sediment is part of it. You know, the sediment is the thing that we need to is what we need to convert deep water habitat into habitat that can support emergent vegetation. And what's deep kind of varies. You know, in a saltwater area, it doesn't have to be all that deep at all before it's too deep. There's too much salt stress and really sulfide stress for the plants to make it. You know, maybe just, you know, 6 inches, you know, it seems almost too deep. In a freshwater area, it can be a foot deep, and those, you know, you don't have any salt stress, you don't have any sulfide stress, and those perennial plants, they can move out in a foot of water, but, you know, even a foot and a half, probably too deep. Once you get too deep, you need mineral sediments. But other than that, once you've got the vegetation growing, the vegetation makes the elevation. It's that peat. And that's why marsh management, managing vegetation for waterfowl foods, in my mind, is just one step away from managing marsh vegetation for elevation gain.
Thank you.
It's a pep talk instead of an answer.
Do you foresee there being, like you said, managing for duck food vegetation might be the solution for multiple issues? Do you think there is one solution that will meet the criteria for many problems, or do you think that we're going to have to manage it to a point where we have different solutions for different functions of a wetland?
Yeah, no, most of your waterfowl food plants, most of the best ones are annual plants who put all their energy into seeds and not roots. And so if you're going to manage for elevation, you're not going to be able to manage for duck foods for that year or 2 or 3. But once you have enough elevation gain, then you could go ahead and you know, burn it or flood it out and let the annuals come in for a year or 2 and create seeds for the ducks, and then you can flood that out and have some mud flat for the shorebirds, and then go back to managing for elevation. So, you know, we can't have our cake and eat it too. We can manage sequentially in one place, you know, over time, I hope. But then also what allows one plant to be good at making elevation might at one place might not work in another place. You know, typha might be the species you want in this particular salinity and iron level, But bullwhips might work over in that salinity and that level of phosphorus. And unfortunately, it's going to be up to people paying a lot of attention to a very slow process to figure this out.
Yes, we have some more questions rolling in.
Good.
So Melinda would like to know, would opening the Morganza spillway or creating another diversion source into the Atchafalaya Basin to the Gulf promote marsh/land growth? The recent hurricanes have essentially destroyed barrier wetlands.
I think putting more water down through Morganza would accelerate the conversion of swamp to bottomland hardwood forest in the Atchafalaya Basin. And that might be desirable by some people and undesired by others, particularly crawfishermen and the people who like the swamp basin crawfish. But it would certainly, so it would accelerate that conversion. And I believe it would also accelerate the creation of new wetlands out at the Atchafalaya Delta and the Wax Lake Outlet Delta. So yeah, I think it would accelerate land creation in the bays, but I think you would run into some problems with values inside the Atchafalaya Basin. What do we want to use that area for? Do we want to? Well, there's a lot of public relations to go through to make something like that happen. Yeah, and we're losing our barrier islands, and that might be the time when you pull that car over on the side of the interstate and you walk away from it. I'm not sure.
So just thinking along those lines, our map is constantly changing with accretion and erosion and such. So when they're doing management type projects, is the goal to keep the same type of wetland with the same functions and values in the same exact location, or are they managing in a way that's like, no, those were the conditions before, but now we have these conditions, so we're going to go with this type of wetlands and these types of functions and values? Yes.
It kind of depends, if you've got the resources to manage it hard, but I'm managing hard, I mean, by, if you've got good water control ability, then you're going to control the water and you're going to have your drawdowns. And so you can put some annual plants in those mud flats, and then you're going to flood it up so you can, irrigate those annual plants. And then you're going to keep it flooded during the winter so the birds can get in there. Then you're going to drain it so the water birds can get there in that mud flat in the spring. But if you don't have good water control, you're not going to be able to do that. And so every unit is kind of different, and every manager has, I wish it was, the landscape is just so different. As a researcher, I get to focus on the big commonalities, and we search for those common things. But the land manager's stuck dealing with a field or a management unit that is half one soil type, half another. The water control structure doesn't work as well as it did last year. It leaks more. Plus, subsidence has lowered its levee, so now he gets more storm flood over the levee. And so what used to work doesn't work. And the marsh management is it's a jigsaw puzzle. And if you like that sort of stuff, great. But if you don't, it's frustrating. And I got to admit, I'm not a manager. I talk about it and read about it, and think about it, but I'm not the guy deciding when to pull a board, or when to, flood it back up, when to set the fire. So the goals are just, the goals are always on the table. All right.
Any other questions out there? We're about 4 minutes away from the 8 o'clock hour. Do you have any questions?
I'm going to skip my last one. I just want to go to my very last slide then. I want to make a point, and this is an uncomfortable point to make. This is the way we manage wetlands. And, and a lot of people don't like management, but, we don't have pristine landscapes anymore. And in my opinion, we need management to make the land more natural, as crazy as that sounds. If you've got these artificial roads and levees, it's not going to burn naturally anymore. You have to set those fires yourself. It's not going to flood naturally or drain naturally. So we've got to do some stuff. And so this income that we can get from wetland functions are going to be important, because the oil and gas that paid for all the management we've got is about gone. That income is not what it was. The income to maintain levees, water control structures, professional managers to watch these areas and try to manage them as best they can, that's declining. You know, so we're going to have to rely on the wetland functions to manage the wetlands. It's timber harvest where we have it, where it's sustainable. You know, commercial harvest, alligators, hunting leases, carbon credits. These are the things that I can see helping us to pay for the wetland management, so that we can get another couple of decades or maybe another century or two out of some of these acres. But in the long run, you know, it actually gets a little scarier. And this is the uncomfortable part. It's human population. You know, this graph, the numbers here are so small, I'll redid them here. So in 1950, we had a little less than 3 billion people. 70 years later, we're here today, 2020, we got a little less than 8 billion. If we just keep on where we're going, you know, another 70 years, we'll be at almost 15 billion people. During the last 70 years, we're able to feed more and more people on the planet, and actually do a better job in the 2020s than we did in the 1950s because of increasing yield per acre. Now, that meant less loss directly of wetlands to agricultural fields, but it meant much more loss to wetlands indirectly, because wetlands, all that agricultural production requires water, irrigation water, and wetlands losing groundwater, losing surface water. A lot of indirect impacts, tremendous amounts of indirect impacts on wetlands during the last 70 years. For the next 70 years, what little reading I've done, they say we can't keep increasing yield per acre. We're just going to have to get more acres of agricultural land. And where they're looking is wetlands. And you see that in Canada, where they're logging boreal forest, and instead of replanting it or allowing boreal forest to grow back, they're putting it into agricultural fields because the growing season's longer and because the market and demand is there. And then coastal wetlands are even more uncertain, because in addition to pressure to, you know, get as much food out of them, you're going to have the rising sea level, and we got to manage that elevation. We have to figure out how to manage for elevation as well. So it's a challenge and exciting jigsaw puzzle for the next 70 years, I believe. And there, right at 8 o'clock, we're done.
Perfect. Kristen says, thank you very much. It was a great presentation and an enjoyable webinar experience. So thank you, Andy. Do you mind staying on just for a couple of minutes to see if anybody has any questions?
Happy to.
That's kind of a scary graph right at the end.
It is, and I've been thinking about this for decades and have been afraid to talk about it. It's so uncomfortable, because how do you deal with this? You know, like China did? Gosh, it's horrible. You know, what are we going to do? But we can't, if we don't talk about it, we're not going to figure it out.
True enough. Any questions out there? Remember, you guys have the ability to turn your mics on. So if you do have a question and want to ask yourself, you can do that. Otherwise, we'll see. Oh, I do have an announcement while you're still on. We're gonna take a little bit of a break because of the fall holiday this month, but we will have one webinar in December. And I think, Becca, if you're out there, please help. I think it's the December 10th or 11th, just because of the holiday season. We do have one in December. Wear an ugly sweater. eat something festive during the webinar. But a great topic by another great scientist and consortium faculty member with LumCon. So remember us in December. We do have another question from Arturo. He's asking, what countries are doing things right? What countries are doing things wrong in regards to wetland management?
it seems to me that wetland management is a luxury for the developed world. You know, you look at other parts of the world and they have protected areas that the people, the adjacent, the neighbors, the people around there need to use for food and housing and firewood. And that protecting wetlands and managing wetlands is a luxury. And so I think it's the richest countries that are doing the best. But then also when I look to Europe, I went to, I've been to Europe twice, and I went to the European wetland I went to was a farm. That was their natural area, I'm sorry. You know, that it wasn't their wetland, it was their natural area. But to them, a farm was as natural as they get. There's just, it's so developed over there. There's so few wetlands. The ones they have, I think they're doing okay. But the very first natural area in the Netherlands, 1906, was created for birds, and today is threatened by loss of groundwater and excess nutrients in the water that it does get. And it's these off-site problems that are causing the problems in the developed world. But it takes luxury to manage, to have wetlands and wildlife.
Do you think the one of the greatest threats to wetlands is the lack of water, or is it mismanagement, or is it just plowing them under for agricultural fields?
I think our need to feed people is the greatest threat to wetlands. And then the wetlands that remain are indirectly generally starved for wetlands. You also do have some mismanagement. I mean, look, mismanagement happens. There's one of the things that a lot of the wetlands some of the wetlands established on national wildlife refuges out west were established during a time of drought. And so they're always afraid of losing their water. On top of that, if they let water go, the surrounding farmers claim that they don't need water and therefore they should not be given so much water in future years. And so we end up with very stable, permanent water levels in wetlands that should be seasonal and should dry out and have natural cycles of disturbance and succession. And so, you know, there's room to improve management on managed wetlands. And the other thing is that right now, I think all the managed wetlands are managed for wildlife. You know, you've got some wetland mitigation banks out there that are, you're starting to see some movement to manage them to improve wildlife on them, even though they're a water quality, part of the Water Quality Regulatory Agency. But that's an excellent question. And I should have said I don't know. I'm sorry.
It's food for thought, right? Again, like you said, if you don't ask the questions, you don't get the answers. So appreciate it. Becca did say confirmation. Our next talk is December 10th. So please join us then. Andy, I want to thank you so much. That was such a great, informative, while uncomfortable, much needed presentation.
Well, I appreciate the chance to try. I put much of that together earlier this year for a book chapter. It was fascinating to read all that stuff, but just to get out of my rut. And that was my first attempt to ever share it with anybody. I appreciate y'all.
Well, you did a great job. You have a lot of thank yous and great presentations coming in. So again, thank you so much. You're always a pleasure to interact with. Always. And
hey, look, the 45 minutes with you went by so fast before waiting for this. It was a great time.
It's not usually a comment here. Really? We just looked at blank egg for 45 minutes.
It's 7 o'clock. We gotta get going here.
That's awesome. I thank you so much. And audience, for those of you who are still on, you are awesome too. Remember to keep coming back. One thing I do want to mention is we have not made a decision whether we are going to continue the LumCon Science Talks beyond December. If you have strong opinions one way or the other, please feel free to send an email. Feedback is really important and we take it very seriously. So if you want to see more LumCon Science Talks, please feel free to send an email. If you don't, feel free gonna send an email. Um, that's all important information. But I really hope you guys have a really good fall holiday. And Andy, you and your family, I hope you all stay happy and healthy and everything. So everybody stay safe, take care of yourselves, and take care of each other because it's important.
Thank you, Mert. Thank you, audience.
Good night, everyone.
Night. Let's see.